Dan, for this story, you talked to a mortgage expert. What was their reaction to this predicament and to the deal?
Yeah, so basically, Donald Trump was in sort of a difficult position because, on the one hand, he had 6 years remaining on this lease that was paying him at the time $22 million a year. On the other hand, he had a loan that was expiring in September of 2022 with $100 million coming due. He had to repay that loan one way or another. One way would have been just with cash, but in mid 2020, he only had about $93 million in cash on hand. So that wasn't going to suffice. The other option was to refinance, which ultimately is what he decided to do. But if you're going to go to a bank and say, hey, I'd like a loan for, say, 10 years for $100 million, it's going to be difficult if you then say that the driver of the rent in the building against which you're borrowing is only has 6 years left on its lease. And so what the mortgage expert said, which made a lot of sense, is that if you're going to a loan to a bank in that circumstance, you're going to want to renegotiate that lease to make sure that it is around for longer. That makes sense why Trump would have been willing to even discuss a lease at a time like 2020, when it would have been so hard for him not to get basically crushed by his tenant in those negotiations and ultimately accept a lower amount of rent.
So, financially speaking, was this the better option opposed to paying in cash, paying that 100 million, but not having enough, so essentially falling short, since he did only have 93 million in cash?
It was certainly the safer option. He could have gotten cash in other ways, selling properties, refinancing other things, and taking cash out through that. And he ultimately did end up collecting additional sums of cash through those methods. So it's possible that he could have found a different way to pay it off. And he also might have been able to refinance, say, with somebody at a sky high interest rate, even knowing that that Gucci lease was going to expire. It's just hard to know without running the alternative which one would have made him more money. Do you pay more interest now and then take a chance of what's going to happen in 2026 if Gucci decides to leave? Or do you take less rent now, but have it be more secure both for you and for your lender, therefore giving yourself lower interest expenses in the meantime? Those are the calculations that they would have been considering at the time. And ultimately, what they chose was a much more safe move.
Donald Trump famously wrote The Art of the Deal, but the Trump organization seemed to really get the short end of the stick in this negotiation. From your years of covering Donald Trump and his businesses, has he ever been in a similar position?
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump has been in challenging positions for years, in and out. You know, he's had his highs and his lows. This was an interesting challenge for him to figure out how to basically rework all of his debt, not just the one at Trump Tower, and come out through that stronger and able to still be able to manage his business. Ultimately, what the Trump organization did was basically to play it pretty safe. You know, they kicked the can down the road on several of their loans. They sold off a money-losing hotel in Washington, D.C. They sucked cash out of one of their best performing properties in San Francisco, and ultimately stored up a bunch of cash, delayed the expiration on their loans, and are still standing. So at this point, it looks like it was a successful move in some ways. The downside is that it also limited their potential for growth. Their properties are not as profitable after debt expenses as they had been previously, or potentially as they could have been if they had taken a riskier approach. But Donald Trump, after years of taking huge risks and at times ending up on the wrong side of things after doing so, apparently had passed that lesson down to his heirs, who decided to play more safely in this time.
So, is playing it safe sort of unprecedented when it comes to the Trump organization and business deals?
No, they've played it safe in other instances, but you know, they're inconsistent. I mean, sometimes they take huge risks, and other times they try to play it a little bit cooler. Certainly, if you had asked that question in, say, 1988, yeah, it would have been totally unprecedented. But Donald Trump got humbled in the early 1990s and started doing business in a different way. partially because he had learned his lesson in some respects, but also partially because his ability to borrow money just wasn't the same as it had been before, because he had burned so many banks that people weren't going to trust him, and therefore his interest expenses were going to be much higher. So yes, he has played it safe in the past, and I suspect that we'll continue to see him play it relatively safe financially from this point forward, given that he's at this point a pretty old man, not doing much in the way of new entrepreneurial ventures other than his social media company, which probably hasn't required a ton of cash from him. I expect him to basically sit back, enjoy his few $1 billion, and make a bunch of noise in politics.